นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนัมมัสสามิ Good evening to everybody. Welcome to Bodhipala Monastery. This weekend we're celebrating 2 years of Bodhipala Monastery, the second anniversary. So Bodhipala Monastery is a new monastery. Sometimes people ask what the word Bodhipala means. Bodhi refers to the enlightened knowledge or the awakened knowledge of the Buddha, of an enlightened mind, an awakened mind. Pala means protector or guardian. So this is a place where we guard over or protect the awakened knowledge of the Buddha. And how do we do that? Well, we protect it through the practice, following the teachings of the Buddha and cultivating the same qualities and insights and understanding that will bring us the same experience of awakening that the Buddha experienced. By coincidence, it's also the 10th anniversary of the passing away of one of our teachers, Ajahn Mahabua. If you can see, his picture is up here on the shrine, over here in the corner. He was a monk who lived more or less the same generation as our teacher, Lumpur Cha, another monk from the forest tradition of northeast Thailand. And he was a monk who, like Ajahn Chah, we believe to be somebody who was awakened to the truth, had experienced insight into Nibbana, the end of suffering. So even though it's sad to think of the passing away of a teacher, it's also remembering his life brings up gratitude, sense of good fortune having met and practiced with such a teacher, Ajahn Mahabua, similarly to Lumpur Cha. When I first came to Australia, he was one of the teachers I went to visit to pay respects before leaving Thailand. And I told him I'd be coming to live in Melbourne, where I live normally. And he, because he knew me, over many years I'd visited with him and trained with him. So he said, wherever the students of Ajahn Chah go in the world, if they practice what Ajahn Chah taught, then they will bring progress and blessings and happiness to that place. So we took those words with us when we left Thailand to go and begin Buddha Bodhivana Monastery near Melbourne. And I think we can use the same teaching here in Bodhipala, a new monastery in South Australia. If everybody here follows the teachings and practices that Lumpur Cha left us, then it will bring good things to us all. It'll lead to our progress, and the practice will flourish here. So these occasions, we are remembering the birth of Bodhipala Monastery 2 years ago, and then also remembering the passing away of Lumpur Mahabua. There's a very Buddhist reflection, birth and death, arising and cessation, they're part of the same thing. They're two ends, two aspects of the same thing. The nature of our existence as human beings is transient, subject to change, impermanent. Every day we experience the arising and passing away of different moods and mental phenomena, mental experiences. Every day we're experiencing the changes in our body. Our body is constantly changing with the aging process and just the normal natural processes we have as human beings. We wake up in the morning, we eat food, we digest the food, we drink, we move around, we get tired, we expend energy, we rest, then we expend more energy, and so on. Our body is constantly changing and aging, and our mental activity is constantly changing. We have different thoughts and moods and memories coming into our mind, passing through our mind, passing out again. So birth and death come together. A few years ago, Bodhipala Monastery didn't exist. This was a sheep farm. The place was here, but the concept, the idea of Bodhipala Monastery wasn't here yet. And then a few years ago, because of the growing interest in the Buddhist teachings and the faith of Buddhists, the property was purchased and turned into Bodhipala Monastery. Same land, same buildings, but now called a monastery. Hopefully that's something that everybody can rejoice in, feel happy about. Another Buddhist monastery has started in the world. There are, of course, probably tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Buddhist monasteries, temples, hermitages, meditation centers throughout the world. The number is growing daily. That's another sign of change, isn't it? You might say it's a sign of change for the good. It's a positive change for the world. If a piece of land that had sheep on it has changed into a place where people come to practice the Dhamma following the Buddha, that's an amazing change. It's a great opportunity for many good things to arise in this particular place. So to start a monastery and support a monastery and live in a monastery or visit a monastery, this is a great blessing. And it's a particular blessing because a monastery is a place that's here for the long haul. Normally speaking, you don't buy and sell monasteries. That's different from a house. We all talk about property prices and house prices in the world. But you don't talk about monastery prices because you don't buy and sell them. Once it starts, that's it. You just keep going. And so the hope is that this monastery will continue to flourish well beyond our lifetimes into the future, just as there have been many monasteries in the past started and are still going today. Who knows how long it will last? We really couldn't predict, but as long as there are people with faith and interest to practice, then this monastery will continue, just as those other monasteries do. And so it's not only a good place for us, it will be a good place for our children or future people, generations of people interested either in ordination as monks, nuns, or as lay practitioners. It has that potential. So a monastery is a very special place. The physical surroundings are still the same. Same rocks, same trees, same buildings. But the way we look at it has changed now. It's no longer a sheep farm, it's now a monastery. And with that comes all the significance of a monastery. It's a place where you practice the Buddhist teachings, where you preserve or protect the enlightened knowledge of the Buddha. through the practice. So, monasteries usually have libraries. So we have library with the Buddhist texts, the Tripitaka. But we also have to put those teachings into practice to preserve them, for them to have meaning. That's why sometimes it's very valuable to remember the living teachers like Ajahn Chao, Ajahn Mahabua, who have been such good examples, guiding examples for the older generation who knew them and lived with them, because they provide a link back to the time of the Buddha. The Buddha passed away a long time ago, but it's because there have been ordained Sangha practicing continuously since the time of the Buddha that you could say the Buddhist teachings have been preserved in the world. As we know, the Buddhist texts weren't even written down to start with. They were preserved as an oral tradition by Sangha who would memorize them, laity as well. The tradition of memorizing teachings, reciting them, whether you call that chanting or just reciting the words. That's how the first period of the Buddha's teachings were, how the teachings were transmitted from one generation to another. People remembered them. And it's a form of meditation, isn't it? Learning to recite verses, recite suttas, remember the teachings through recitation. And that requires practice. They say they didn't write them down in those days, and it wasn't because their writing didn't exist. But in those days, they say people didn't trust the written word because they thought somebody might change what you've written. You write something down and you pass that piece of paper or that palm leaf to somebody else, and maybe they'll go and change it. So they chose to record the teachings or memorize, commit them to memory, and the tradition was to memorize them exactly. So it takes a lot of mindfulness, a lot of effort to do that. And there are still Sangha members these days who will commit themselves to memorizing, at the very least, the rules of discipline, what we call the Patimokkha, and other suttas, like the Satipatthana Sutta, or the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, and so on. So that's been a part of our practice. But there's more to it as well. We memorize the teachings, we listen to them, memorize them, but then we have to practice them. And that's what really makes a monastery, a place of practice, is the practice that every individual puts into the monastery in one way or another. So they have this, the story of building a monastery, and somebody comes to the monastery and they see maybe a lady arranging some flowers. And they say, "What are you doing?" And they answer, "I'm building a monastery." The person didn't quite get it. They said, "Aren't they doing flower arranging for the shrine, for the Buddha shrine?" But they answered, "I'm building a monastery." Then they come along and they see another person, maybe a monk or a trainee, sweeping leaves, and they ask them, they say, "What are you doing?" They say, "I'm building a monastery, cleaning the path." They see somebody else, maybe laying some bricks or some rocks. Here it would be rocks. In South Australia, a lot of rocks are used in building. "What are you doing?" "Oh, I'm building a monastery." Somebody else maybe is in the kitchen cooking. "What are you doing?" "Oh, I'm building a monastery." Everybody answers the same, but they're all true in the sense they're all doing something that goes to complete the whole picture of building a monastery. Because a monastery is made up of many activities and actions. It comes to fruition through the efforts of many people in many different ways. And you might say that nobody is more valuable or important than anyone else. Whether you're sweeping leaves, cooking food, arranging flowers, laying rocks, building, or maybe there's someone in the corner quietly meditating. They're also building a monastery because they're building their heart and practicing the teachings. In that moment, they're maybe practicing mindfulness, or contemplating some aspect of the Dhamma, and that's also building a monastery. So every part goes to make the whole. There's not one thing that is the monastery. It's made up, the monastery is made up of many different buildings. We have a meditation hall or an ordination hall. We have kutis, accommodation is called a kuti. We have a kitchen, have toilets, have library. Many buildings, many different functional buildings. They're all part of the whole, which is the monastery. Could even say every rock, every blade of grass is part of the monastery because they all come within the boundary of the monastery. I don't know if the kookaburras and the parrots know it, but they're part of the monastery too because they live here. And there's an itinerant koala who comes through from tree to tree. He or she is part of the monastery too. So a monastery is made up of many individual parts, people and their practice and their contribution, however big, however small, they go together to make a monastery. It's a place where people come and practice out of faith, out of inspiration. They're motivated to, first of all, come here. We're out of town, so it takes some effort to come to a monastery. You give up half your day or maybe a whole day to drive here. It's not near enough. There's one or two people who can walk here. Some of our neighbours can walk here, but most people have to drive here. So it takes effort, commitment. You have to want to come to a monastery. And then you get here and you participate in the different activities. And this all makes a monastery, and many people come from many directions. It's a very multicultural place. People come from different backgrounds, different ethnic groups, age groups, genders. The whole range of, say, Australian society is seen in a monastery. Many different people. And they all cooperate together to practice together, and we say build a monastery. But build in the broader sense, build the qualities of the heart that we're building and cultivating in a monastery. They all go together to make the whole. It's not a commercial venture. It's a bit different from any kind of place you go where you may pay money for an entry ticket or a membership fee, or things are bought and sold, like most businesses, They may also be places where many different people go and participate, but a monastery is not a commercial thing. You come here because of your faith, your interest. It draws you in. Nobody makes you come. You come voluntarily. So that means that the atmosphere and the kind of perceptions people have around a monastery are quite unique in the world, because it's like that. It's a place that is built on faith and a common interest, say, in understanding the Buddhist teachings more, and from that understanding ourselves more. So that's what the Buddhist teachings are pointing to. It's giving us ways and means for us to understand ourselves as human beings and to free ourselves from stress, suffering, the unhappinesses that can overtake us in life. It's a place where we're learning to understand ourselves better so we can free ourselves from that. So a unique place and a very special place in the world, because it's a place where people from different backgrounds, different places come together and can cooperate and work together and practice together. Just now we were all meditating together, sitting quietly. If you think about it, that's quite an amazing thing in the world. A group of people come together and just sit quietly for a period of time. Nobody made us do that. We wanted to do that out of our faith, our interest. There's a sense in a monastery, another thing is a sense of trust, isn't it? You come to a monastery, you trust in the good behavior, the good intention of the other people who live here, the Sangha, the people who visit. That sense of trust brings up a good feeling, doesn't it? You come to a monastery, you're not on edge, you're not suspicious or worried about the people around you, you trust in their practice. So that's another important factor that brings us a sense of peace, well-being when we're in a monastery. As we know, you come to a monastery, maybe you put your bag down, normally speaking, not always, but normally speaking, you don't have to worry that someone will pinch your things. You don't have to worry that someone will come along and abuse you or insult you or something. That doesn't normally happen in a monastery. It's a place where people are peaceful, with a common interest, and they're practicing the Dhamma. Again, this is a very unique thing in the world. There's not many places you can go and feel at peace and have that sense of well-being like when you're here or in another similar place. And particularly for understanding our own hearts and minds and freeing them from the causes of stress and suffering, well, that is a very good foundation. You have a place that's come about through the goodness of people's hearts. People contribute in many different ways regularly. When you're here, you have that sense of being relaxed, at ease. You can trust the other people around you. So when you come to meditate, you can close your eyes, you can relax quite easily. And that's an important thing when you're developing meditation. You have to have that sense of ease or well-being. When you're in a monastery, you're not too worried about what other people are doing around you, but you still have your own mind to deal with, and that usually is the biggest source of suffering. Once you have found a quiet, peaceful place, and it's convenient to practice, you still have to deal with your own mind, with all its attachments and personal issues and problems that we've accumulated over our lifetime. But in order to have a look at all of that and understand it better, you need that outward environment, the sense of well-being and the peaceful environment, the good place, so that you can turn your attention inwards. So ultimately, another vital part of a monastery is a place where you can practice mindfulness. Learning to pay attention to your body, mind, being more aware of yourself from moment to moment. It's a place that is conducive, supportive of that. Most people will agree, when you're trying to practice mindfulness and meditation and develop the skill in investigating Dhamma, contemplating the Dhamma, when you do that at home, it's quite challenging. Maybe if you live on your own, it's a bit easier, but even then, sometimes we easily get distracted. But even more so when we live in a family, the more people we live with, the more obstacles there might be to practicing, particularly practicing meditation, isn't it? Because other people have their own interests, and they do things at different times, and they maybe are not practicing mindfulness or meditation. So it's good to have a place where you can go specifically dedicated to that. It's not that you can't practice at home, it's just usually it's a bit harder. We all know when we're at home, we usually take the easy route. We sleep when we want to sleep, we eat when we want to eat, we watch TV or get onto our computer, we talk, we chat. So to take a few moments just to become more mindful of your breath can be quite difficult, even though it's a very simple task. But to find the time, the opportunity becomes harder when we're living at home. So when you come to a meditative monastery, a meditative environment, it's supportive of that. If you come to a monastery and you don't say much at all to anyone, but you just participate, do the activities, that's fine. You come into the meditation hall and you don't have to speak to anyone. You just sit quietly with yourself observing yourself, getting to know yourself better, even though you might be sitting in a large crowd of people. You can do that. You can, you come, maybe you're just doing some job, preparing food, preparing flowers, sweeping leaves, helping out. You may have a conversation with someone, and that's important as well. We do talk to each other about the Dhamma, and that helps us to understand better. But then sometimes we just quietly do our thing, and that's fine. We can go into a corner and sit under a tree and meditate for a while, and that's fine. If you do that at home, maybe somebody will say, "Hey, what are you doing?" They'll question you, they'll doubt you, they'll maybe find something wrong with it. But in a monastery, you can do all these things quite comfortably, quite happily. So it's a place where you can really cultivate the path. You can trust in the similar intention of the other people here, and you can develop that intention for yourself. And you can keep doing that over and over again, because a monastery, it's a place for practice, and that function doesn't change. Maybe sometimes a monastery is busier than others. If there's an event, more people come, it's a bit busier. Other times it's very quiet. But the basic purpose of a monastery never changes. It's a place to practice the Dhamma. It's a place for practicing generosity, kindness, learning to live mindfully in a virtuous way, where we're more mindful of our speech, our actions, not to harm ourselves or others, and where we can really develop a deeper sense of mindfulness and introspection, turning our attention to observe our own body and mind more closely so we can see some of the truths that the Buddha was pointing to. We can do all that in a monastery over and over again, so it's a chance, you have the chance to improve your practice very well in a monastery. It's not always easy, because of our mind. You come to a monastery, sometimes we'll have our own moods we bring with us. So sometimes people come and they think it will be a good day or a good time they're going to spend in the monastery, but then the mind is too restless. And that's not the fault of the monastery, that's just their own restlessness, the karma they've accumulated. Maybe they have some unfinished business. So many meditators, they come to sit meditation and they have all these wishes to find peace and states of calm, but they spend all their time thinking about that job that they've got to do, that work, the unfinished piece of work, the unfinished conversation they've got to have with that person, that place they've still got to visit. Some people are sitting there going through their shopping list for the week, shopping list of things to get, places to go, tasks to do. That's what our mind does. It accumulates many memories and desires based on those memories and much information, and often we're not managing that very well. So when you come to meditate, it all starts spilling out into our consciousness. So sometimes people, they come in with that good intention to meditate, but very quickly the restlessness of the mind takes them away. Can't sit still. I think most of us will have experienced that. Maybe you can only meditate for a few minutes and then, well, that's enough. Have to leave. So sometimes people physically leave the monastery, although not that often, but sometimes they get up, they can't sit still. This is why we have to practice mindfulness. It's a quality of mind, this ability to pay attention to the present moment is such a central part of monastic practice and just training the mind in general. Because our mindfulness is not yet very strong. So a monastery is a very good place where we can practice mindfulness. We can do sitting and walking meditation and just mindful behavior as we go about our business. It's something we need to improve. And the practice of sitting and walking meditation helps with that. Earlier I was talking about Ajahn Mahabua, one of our meditation teachers who passed away 10 years ago. Sometimes when I'd go with him to visit a monastery, he'd go around Thailand to visit monasteries in the last part of his life. And he'd arrive and he'd see a kuti, a hut where a meditator would stay And he said, that's the place to practice meditation. Or he'd see a walking path. He'd say, that's the place to practice meditation. That's where a monk does his work. So he'd give that reflection. Your meditation is a form of work. But you're working with yourself, not for any payment or any sort of worldly reward, but you're working to understand and be more aware of yourself. Because this quality of mindfulness and then clear comprehension, clear understanding, the more we bring it up, the more we can see ourselves, know ourselves. And this is where the teachings of the Buddha really become valuable, where we can really look after our own personal well-being and happiness. Because the more you practice mindfulness, whether it's sitting or walking meditation or just involved in whatever activities you're doing, the more opportunity you have to see your own mind, to see the truth of your own mind and see how easily it gets led astray by moods, trains of thought. You know, as you're meditating just for a period of time like we did just now for half an hour, you'll notice one thought comes, maybe it's very easy to let go of because it was a very random or mundane thought, but then another more significant thought comes into your mind and it takes you away from the breath, from the present moment, maybe for many minutes, maybe for the whole half an hour. You've gone off with that train of thought, and one train of thought leads to another train of thought. And so often we don't have awareness of our own mind. We get caught into these different trains of thoughts that come up, prompted by different experiences. Maybe it's a memory, maybe it's just a sound or a feeling in the body. And by association, one thing prompts another, and off we go, not very mindful, not very aware, thinking about something. You could say we're sort of addicted to thinking. And that's, when you don't have anything else to do, what will you do? You'll start thinking about something. Even when you have got something to do, if it's an activity you're used to, like say walking or driving or washing up, many different activities, because we've done them before, we don't have to pay that much attention. The mind would easily just drift away into a thought, and the mind could be miles away thinking about something else, whereas the body is involved in driving a car, walking along, eating one's food, having a bath, but the mind is not there, it's gone. So one of the experiences you notice in meditation is how we have all these little moments of birth and death, or the changing mind states, changing moods going on. And if we're not aware, that's going on all the time. And if we're not aware, we don't see it, we don't know it. And that's often how suffering takes over the mind, isn't it? You have one maybe slightly unpleasant experience, maybe a bit of pain in your body, or you remember something that you weren't happy about that happened, unpleasant memory, and it stimulates a train of thought. And then we link ideas together, memories together, so one thought leads to another, leads to another, leads to another, and off we're gone. And before we come back to the breath, we may have gone a long way and thought about many different things. And as you're meditating, you'll notice this. You'll see, sometimes the thoughts are sort of relevant. They're sort of linked and they seem to make sense for a while. But then one thing leads to another. You think of one event, and then that leads on to thinking about another person or another place, and then other events or other experiences you've had it with that person or in that place. And after a while, you just completely lost track of where you were and what you were doing. Sooner or later, though, you may come back and re-establish mindfulness with the breath, and you realize, where was I? What happened then? And that is going on all the way through our day. If we start practicing more awareness, and particularly in a quiet place like a monastery, you'll see this happening all the time, how the mind gets carried away with its thoughts, and quite often get stuck into moods. Habitual ways of thinking keep coming up. They become like patterns or habit patterns of the mind. So if they're more unskillful or negative, those thoughts will often bring us a lot of pain and suffering, mental pain and suffering, simply through an unawareness, a lack of awareness. So practicing mindfulness gives you this ability to be more aware of your mind and what's going on. Where do we get the stimulation that stimulates all this thinking and that we get addicted to? Well, the Buddha said it's through our senses. So we see things, we hear things, we taste things, touch things, smell things, and then we remember and we think. The mind itself just brings up memories and thoughts and ideas. So these are like what we call the six sense doors. And it's just like a habitual process, always going on day after day. We're having sense stimulation. We see and hear things, or we have memories and ideas pop into the mind, and they stimulate trains of thought. And these are, when it's a more pleasant object, it puts us in a good mood, say. They're more attractive. We have the kind of thoughts that come up are more pleasant, more... we delight in the pleasantness of that thought and that memory or that sense stimulation, or they're unpleasant and it leads to a negative state of mind, a negative train of thought. And that's going on all the time, whether we realize it or not. But as you start to practice mindfulness, you're drawing your attention back to yourself in the present moment more, you'll catch it, you'll see what's happening. And this is vital for understanding the mind and freeing it from the causes of suffering. You'll notice when we lose our awareness, the mind gets caught into what we call craving, wanting, desiring. And this is a kind of an energy that feeds the mind, whether it's craving for things that we haven't got, that we want, we like, or to hold on to them, or the craving to get away from what we don't like, just resist it or actually get rid of it. And this is feeding the movements of the mind all the time through our day. As you practice mindfulness, you see this going on, and at first it can be quite overwhelming and you feel quite defeated. And you think, "Oh, this is difficult. How am I ever going to get more control of my mind?" But the way it works is you keep practicing and you start to see these habits of mind more clearly, coming up more often. And this is where wisdom, understanding arises. One thing you can't help but notice is how your thoughts and moods are impermanent. They're changing all the time, depending on the stimulation and then how your mind reacts. You're seeing change. So we have moods of happiness, moods of sadness, moods of anger, moods of boredom, moods of excitement, changing over and over again. In the course of one meditation, you can be very elated and then very defeated within a few minutes, the space of a few minutes. Your mind can go up, go down. The state of mind can change very quickly and quite dramatically sometimes. Or we can move from being fully awake and alert and then falling asleep. In 1 minute you're awake and seem to be fully aware of what you're doing. A few minutes later you've lost your mindfulness and you're just falling asleep. But as you keep practicing over and over again, you're noticing this and you're learning. You can learn from these experiences. You can learn to see the changing nature of the mind. How different stimulation from the senses or the memories that come up, how they trigger different moods, different trains of thought. And particularly how the mind can go in the way of skillful thinking, what we call skillful or kusala thinking, or in the way of unskillful thinking. Skillful thinking tends to bring the mind some understanding and a feeling of steadiness, even a sense of calm and peace. Unskillful thinking tends to continue the agitation. Unskillful thinking is rooted in greed or attachment, anger, delusion. Doesn't make the mind peaceful. tends to build up more and more of a state of stress, agitation, discontent. So as you're practicing mindfulness, you're seeing these movements of the mind. You're seeing the value of wholesome, skillful thinking, and the harm, the disadvantage of falling into unskillful thinking. So you see a thought of kindness directed to yourself, to somebody else, generally brings the mind a sense of well-being, sense of calm. It's not a difficult thought to tolerate if it's genuine kindness, goodwill, the thought of metta. Whereas the thought of anger, ill will or irritation agitates the mind. As you become mindful, you see there's a clear difference there. One is sustainable and conducive to peace and happiness in the mind. One leads to more stress, more unhappiness. The only way you can recognize that is by establishing awareness and then observing what's going on. So the Buddha encouraged us to do that all the time. Practice more mindfulness, to recognize the quality of our thinking, whether it's wholesome or not, and then to act appropriately. Once you've recognized the thought is unskillful, agitating the mind, conducive to more delusion, more greed, more anger, more suffering, let it go. Stop thinking it. Give it up. And by establishing mindfulness, you have that choice. You have the choice to give up, say, a thought of anger or cultivate the thought of kindness. At any moment, whatever's going on in your mind, you have a choice to influence that. We're not just like victims of our own karma, and whatever mood comes up, that's it. It has to be that way. Of course, our reactions, our moods, our emotions are triggered by many things all the time. But the more we practice mindfulness and investigate, the more we have a chance to choose what we promote in our thinking and our mind, what states of mind we hold on to, what we give up, what we let go. We have some choice there. We can be in charge of that. So the more one practices mindfulness, one has that sense of having more self-control, and that gives one more confidence. And that's a certain kind of happiness, where even though you may have accumulated all kinds of negative habits through your life, and it comes up as you start practicing meditation, you can see when you're mindful, you have a choice whether to go with it or to just give it up, ignore it, let it go. Just as we do anyway on the outside, every day in our lives we're making choices. How we spend our time, what activities we're involved with. Sometimes we don't have much choice. Sometimes you have to do things you don't really want to, but you have to do. So occasionally there are things, but a lot of the time we have choices. Where we go, what we do, how we spend our time. Mentally we have that similar ability. We can choose what we think. It's one way the Buddha described himself. This awakened knowledge, the awakened knowledge of the Buddha. The Buddha said, I can choose what to think. I don't have to think a negative or stressful thought. I have that much control, because he's changed his mind. He's developed it to the point where he knows his own mind. And if he sees a thought is skillful, unproductive or harmful, stressful, he abandons it, lets it go. And that's the product of practicing the Dhamma, practicing dana, sila, bhavana, practicing mindfulness and learning to contemplate his own experience and not let his moods and his worries and anxiety just overwhelm his mind all the time, but to actually just see who is responsible for that worry, anxiety, or different kinds of stress. Or we are, through letting our mind just go its own way, uncontrolled, unmanaged, unaware. So when you think of the monastery, that's one way you can think of this monastery. You say it was a place where you practice developing awareness, mindfulness, understanding, wisdom, cultivate skillful qualities of body, speech and mind. So it's a place where you can experience more peace, more happiness, more understanding, and you can abandon the causes of stress through your practice. It's not always easy. The practice requires patient effort, and the mind isn't an easy thing to deal with. It's a very frustrating thing to deal with. We all know what it's like when you try to be mindful and your mind is just rushing with a train of thought or a particular mood has taken you over. But it can be done, and a monastery is a place for that. We know what it's like doing physical training for sport, for exercise, good health. Monastery is a place for doing that mental training. And you can get physical exercise here as well. You can come and help chop wood or do something useful in the monastery as well to exercise your body. But it's really a place for exercising and developing your mind in a good way to overcome the causes of suffering. Maybe even sometimes you're not in the monastery because you can't be here all the time, so you're at home and you think of the monastery, even just thinking of it, visualizing it, remembering it, what happens there, some of the good experiences you've had there, can be enough to bring your mind mindfulness at that moment, or bring your mind to a wholesome state when you're stressed or worried. Maybe even just thinking of other people practicing in the monastery when you're not there can uplift you. You've got to go to your job or do some activity, you think, oh, I wish I was on retreat back in the monastery. Well, even that can uplift you in the midst of some more mundane activity or maybe even some unpleasant situation. I know somebody who was in hospital and they said, oh, they had to undergo surgery and they're very scared, don't know what the outcome would be. I said, well, how did you calm your mind before you went under the anesthetic? I said, I thought of the monastery. When I go to the monastery, I'm very happy. Seeing the Buddha statue, offering some things, listening to Dhamma, practicing mindfulness, it always makes me happy to think of that. So I thought of that. That was the last thing I thought of as I went under the anesthetic. So even if you aren't in the monastery, you can still benefit from the monastery by just remembering it. Remembering some of the activities you've done, some of the meditation you've done, some of the people you've met, some of the things you've participated in. This can all help. So hopefully Bodhipala Monastery can be a cause for happiness in your life over the coming years, a place where you can come and practice, get some guidance, some good examples, some inspiration. And that way the monastery will grow, but not just outwardly, the physical monastery, but inwardly in your own hearts. I think that's what it's supposed to be. That's how it's supposed to help people. So maybe for tonight I've said enough. I'll just leave you with these words and wish you all well and wish the monastery happy birthday, and may Bodhipala Monastery have many more years of successful practice, and may many more monastics and lay people come here and flourish in the Dhamma.
Tamayang Vatakatha Sadhu Karang Tadamase Sadhu